And awesome. And once again, it is Nijay and Mike here together to talk about things in New Testament studies. Now, I don't know about you, Nijay, but a lot of my students really appreciated our discussion about Philippians. They really liked it, seeing some of the issues we brought up, the Christ hymn, the Christ poem, and the provenance of Philippians and everything. So that was good. So I thought it was a good idea for us to do it again, this time to cover the Gospel of John. Now, which is a little bit awkward for both of us because I've spent most of my career kind of like in synoptic Gospels and a little bit of Paul and floating around a few other places. And you're pretty much a Paul guy. So what is the Gospel of John for you? So what's your relationship with the Gospel of John?
Yeah, I've always been fascinated by it, Mike, and I hate to make all things go back to Paul, but there are a lot of resonances, as you know, between John and Paul. Just as John was not as tuned into Kingdom of God language, so Paul, just as John is interested in belief, which we'll talk about later. So there's some interesting connections there. I wrote an article, I think maybe my very first academic article was on the Gospel of John. You probably don't know that because it was in a little seminary journal.
I did not know that.
It was on honor and shame in the Gospel of John. So since then, I've kind of had a special place in my heart. I started out my teaching career doing some adjunct work for Asbury Seminary, and I taught the Gospel of John several times, and I just kind of fell in love with it through teaching it. So I've been really interested. I like when writers do something different, and John is doing something different, famously called the Maverick Gospel. And so even though I'm an armchair Johannine-ist, I think it's kind of a fun thing to poke around, and I love teaching on John.
Yeah, I mean, the way I describe the Gospel of John to my students, like we have three major cities in Australia: Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, and then we have this kind of little hippie town called Nimbin, where you go to start your own cult, grow various sort of cultural products, get in tune with nature and new age stuff. So I say the synoptics are like Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne. John is kind of like Nimbin. It's a little bit different there. It's far more spiritual and mystical. I don't know. I think the American equivalent would be the synoptics are LA, New York, and Houston, and the Gospel of John would be Portland.
Yeah, I was gonna say you're hitting my area here.
Yeah,
that's kind of funny.
It's a little bit weird there. It's different, but I think John is kind of for me a bit of a holiday house. It's somewhere I like to go. Okay, I'm going to put aside all the debates about the synoptic problem and historical Jesus and how Jewish was Paul and justification by faith. I'm just going to work through the gospel, the testimony to Jesus, that type of a thing. And I've taught over several years, usually just kind of like every now and again, like it just sort of comes up every 4 or 5 years. Oh, it's Mike's turn to do the Gospel of John, and you kind of go back and it's like, oh yeah, it's like returning to an old holiday house,
right.
that your parents had when you were younger. You think, oh yeah, it's cool. I remember a bit of this, bit of prologue, bit of man born blind, Jesus is the Christ, various signs, I am. So that's kind of, my relationship. And every time I go back to it, it's kind of like introducing students, taking them a tour of an old holiday house you used to stay in, type of a thing. So that's how I think about the Gospel of John. So, okay.
Let me ask you, this is not my area, gospel studies, and we can talk about some of the interesting stories and themes, but I'm curious what your answer to the question is. What did John, the writer, know about previous gospels? And it's a question of sources, but usually focuses on Mark. There's so many views. What's your take on kind of John and Mark and John and the synoptic tradition?
Oh yeah, that is a big one. There's some people who think that John kind of really, really knows Mark quite well, and possibly Luke, and who knows, maybe even parts of Matthew. And then others who think, well, John's completely independent. I think John definitely has had an encounter with Mark, or he knows of Mark. I don't think he's writing with Mark in front of him, but it's a very good probability he knows of at least Mark's tradition, Mark's material, even if it's only orally or in whatever form. And he is writing in response to that. And I think Richard Balcom is right. He is kind of writing to fill in the gaps. about Mark's gospel, and you see that every now and again there's a little hint, like after John was put into prison, which you don't actually hear about in the Gospel of John, but it's in the Gospel of Mark. So there's a few little hints like that along the way. So I tend to think his tradition is largely independent of the synoptic gospels, but he is aware of them. Definitely Mark, maybe Luke. So that's how I would see that one.
Yeah, that's my impression. What are the chances he just happens to have some of these stories that are kind of famous within the synoptic tradition, the triumphal entry, thing of multitudes. So there has to be something probably shared there, but he's not quoting verbatim from any of these texts. So there is some speculation.
Yeah, I read a good PhD thesis years ago by an Australian guy, a Catholic priest called Ian Mackay, and he went through a number of options, gave a really good survey of what they were, and then kind of did like a synoptic discussion of the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of John on the feeding narrative. Mm-hmm. And I found that a fairly convincing summary of that. There is a type of Markan dependence there, but it's sort of a lighter or somewhat removed than we might otherwise expect if it was just a clear literary relationship. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, there's a whole bunch of big topics in the critical topics in Gospel of John, ranging from who was John, was it John the Apostle or some Elder John, the various sources and that type of thing. I mean, do you have a favorite part of the Gospel of John?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'll say off the bat, I'm not as impressed or kind of elated by the prologue the way that other people are. They see it as this masterpiece. I actually like the prologues or the introductions of the other Gospels a little bit better, like Luke. But I would say some of my favorite parts, I'll say a favorite feature of the Gospel, and that comes out in certain parts. I love dramatic irony. So I'm really interested in some of the dramatic elements. We can come back to this of John. But dramatic irony, this, but maybe other people don't, is where the audience knows something, but the characters in the story don't. And so the narrator knows it, the audience knows it. So there are all these different moments where it's almost comedic, I would say, where comedy, kind of like Comedy of the Airs, Shakespeare, where it's kind of funny when we know things that the characters don't. So for example, the man born blind, he's saying, I don't know who this is, right? And it's really meaning for us because we've been following the gospel all along that we do know who this is. And then you go from that chapter pretty closely into the Raising of Lazarus. And that's one of my favorite stories, the Raising of Lazarus. And there's kind of comedic elements in that too, I think. I remember hearing a speaker, quote from the King James that when he opens the tomb, he says, but Jesus, he stinketh. Or sorry, but Jesus, he stinketh. I love that. That's one of my favorites. That's not quite funny in Greek, but I like that notion that we kind of know what's going to happen because we're reading a gospel, but the characters don't. So they're thinking this is going to be really embarrassing for Jesus. And then Jesus prays, and we're expecting, a very formal prayer, maybe something almost magical or mystical. And his prayer is basically like, Jesus or God, we got this. This is super easy. Let's just do it. It's not even really a prayer as much as an affirmation that's going to happen. So there are all these elements that are, kind of brimmed with dramatic irony that give it that dramatic flavor. I love those scenes. What about you? Do you have any favorites?
Well, unlike you, I rather like my Johannine prologue, Nijay. Very fond of it. For me, it's a bit like the opening of John is like the opening of Star Wars. The opening words just set you alight. Like a long time ago when a galaxy far, far away was the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So it's got that kind of magnetism to it. No, it's good. It kind of sets up, I think, the gospel. I mean, people debate whether the prologue was an independent Gnostic hymn that was then added, that type of thing. I think that's so wrong. But the prologue, assuming it ends down maybe at verse 18, even that's disputed. I mean, it's just like an overture to an opera. It kind of gives you a sneak peek or a highlight to all the various themes and motifs that you can expect. You've got the Word, you've got revelation, life, light, coming to his own but being rejected, climaxing in the Word became flesh and dwelt amongst us. So it's got some of these incredible themes. It's the story, I think, of Easter and Christmas and eternity past all sort of combined together. And it is one of my favorite Christmas passages to, preach and teach from. So yeah, I'm a big fan. I don't mind my prologue to Mark, maybe a bit of Luke, Matthew. I know genealogy and
No, not as much.
yeah.
Well,
Apologies to my
speaking of the
student
prologue, since you're right, it has so much packed into one place. I think some scholars refer to it as an overture. Um, uh, you're one of those rare biblical scholars that's written a systematic theology. Those rare and odd people. And so let me ask you, what do you think John uniquely contributes to the Christian tradition? So, Romans contribute so much as we think about it in terms of justification, things like that. Hebrews contribute some interesting things. What's John's unique and interesting contribution to the Christian tradition?
Oh yeah, I think it's a number of things. I think he certainly accents far more than the synoptic gospels. I think the deity of Jesus, that's obviously one thing. Now, I think Jesus is divine in Mark, Matthew, and Luke, but John takes a slightly different repertoire, a different key, if you like, of trying to, accent that or to stress that. So that's one obvious theme. You've got the big witness theme. That is happening. I mean, the gospel, you've got these various signs, but you've also got these very sort of interviews that go on, Jesus and Nicodemus, Jesus and the woman at the well, and all the other sort of various encounters Jesus has. I think they all in their own way showcase the theme of who is Jesus. That's what comes out of it. You've also got probably a big theme, and this is probably I'll throw back to you. I think John contributes a lot to the topic of faith. What does it mean to believe and behold in Jesus the Christ, the Son of God? So yeah, I think what it contributes to, spiritual depth, witness, Christology, but also importantly the theme of faith. And on that, I think I should throw back to you, since faith is kind of your wheelhouse. What does faith mean in the Gospel of John?
Yeah, it's a really interesting case in the Gospel of John, and it goes back to that question about John's relationship to sources, because John is really interested in the language of believing. John 3:16, right? This is a famous passage throughout the Gospel of John. Belief is important, but he never uses the noun pistis, which is really unusual. I mean, some people wondered, is it a coincidence? It can't be a coincidence. It's so embedded in the Pauline tradition. It's so embedded in the synoptic tradition. It's in virtually every other book. That just kind of like with the situation of Esther, is it an accident that Esther doesn't mention God? No, it can't be an accident. So there has to be some intentionality behind it. Now, that part we know. Why it is the case, we don't know. But there are a couple of answers. One answer is, I think Teresa Morgan has said that John is purposely mimicking pistuo language for the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. It's possible, but the Septuagint does use pistis, so that doesn't solve the problem of why it doesn't use faith language in the noun form. I think a more likely reason is it gives it a more active and dynamic and verbal quality to the way Paul thinks. Sorry, Paul. The way John thinks
Everything
about
by
it.
Paul. Yeah.
Everything goes back there.
Matthew by Paul, Hebrews by Paul, John by
But
Paul.
it gives a more verbal, action-oriented quality to it. I think that's a key part of it. But in terms of what does it mean, I think of pistis and faith language as very elastic. It can mean things across a spectrum of faithfulness, perhaps even close to obedience. It can mean trust. But I think it can also mean belief in the sense of what I call believing the unbelievable. So the example I love to give is, and this kind of movie dates me, but you'll know it, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. So in that movie, one of my favorite movies, Indiana Jones has to get the Holy Grail and he has to pass these tests. And one test is he has to cross this chasm that's impossible to jump. And you'll fall into this pit, endless pit, if you just step in. But he has this guidebook that tells him there is an invisible walkway. So he has to take what's called the leap of faith. And he does, and he realizes there's actually a bridge camouflaged. Sorry to spoil it for you who haven't seen it. But I think John thinks in many of the same ways about belief as coming to a whole different way of looking at not only Jesus, but all of reality through the cross and resurrection of this one person. And so I think belief language for him moves more into the area of epistemology than it does in the other gospels. I think he really that's why you have such stark themes in John of light and darkness, belief and disbelief, because it really has to do with wrapping our minds around something that doesn't fit into our normal way of looking at reality.
Okay. Well, if I'm hearing you right, Nijay, you could sum up the Gospel of John with two artists. So it's ironic like Alanis Morissette, and it's a book of faith like George Michael. You got to have faith.
Well, yeah, that's true. Or maybe MC Hammer. You got to pray just to make it today. I don't know.
Oh, well, yeah, you throw that one in too. You got the high priestly prayer in John 17. Yeah, that makes sense. Of course, these musical references will probably be absolutely meaningless to anyone born after 1995. I guess we're both showing our ages, generation.
But they're old school, which is coming back.
They're
in,
classic.
Like
they're classic.
Stranger Things, where they're throwbacks.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
One of the examples I love about how John tries to get the reader to think differently about values, about the upside down kingdom, would be the language of lifting up in the Gospel of John. So hupsao, lifting up, is a visual image of putting something up. And it's also language of exaltation, of positioning someone in a place of glory and honor. And yet throughout the Gospel, John talks about lifting up Jesus on the cross. And so this is, again, that irony where on the one hand, lifting up should have the connotations of exaltation and glory. But when it's being lifted up on the cross, the world sees this as degradation and shame. And yet the ideal reader is meant to think to themselves, okay, I have to screen out what other people are thinking and saying and recognize this as a Lord of glory. And I don't remember which scholars say this, but there are a number of scholars that say John doesn't narrate an ascension because he wants the positioning of Jesus up high on a cross to be that emblem of Jesus's glorification and not him rising up to heaven and as a way of kind of overcoming the cross. I think that's pretty powerful. When it says he gives up his spirit, you might know this, it actually says he gives over his spirit, paradidomi, which is interesting because that's almost like passing on that same cruciform ministry to his disciples. So I find that really evocative of this interest in John of changing the way people think about power.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Certainly the sort of I'll say collapsing, but the telescoping, the glorification of Jesus into his, I think, cross and, part of his ministry as well, I think is a very key, Johannine distinctive that's going on there. I was going to say other things I found in John I find interesting is, I mean, the sort of the teachings of Jesus in some ways stand out a little bit. I mean, we don't often think of John as being the big teaching gospel, but he does teach a lot about faith, about works. And of course, you've got the famous new commandment, a new commandment I give you, love one another. By this, all men will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. Now, that's a very famous verse, this is the ethics for the new covenant that Jesus's death is bringing in. And I remember reading a quote from, who was it, from Francis Schaeffer, which I got via Timothy George, but Francis Schaeffer, he says, those words, by this all men will know you are my disciple, if you love one another. Francis Schaeffer said something quite shocking. He said, Jesus gives the world the right to determine whether you or I are Christians based on our observable love for one another. So the world gets to determine whether we're Christians, whether the way we treat other Christians, It's like the condition, if you love this, then all people will know you are my disciples. And if you are not loving, then technically they can determine, well, that's not a true disciple, which is quite a very shocking way. The world gets to stand in judgment of the way Christians treat each other and determine whether their faith and their mode of discipleship is actually authentic or not. I mean, that's a very profound statement. If you think about it. So I think there's several statements in the Gospel of John like that, which I find very very challenging and really a cause for reflection. I guess for me, the other passage, this is one of my favorite parts of the Gospel of John, is chapter 5, where I think John gives one of the best definitions of faith. I tell you the truth, whoever hears my word and believes him who sent me has eternal life and will not be condemned. He has crossed over from death to life, which is also combined with an element of sort of a kind of judgment by works. You get in there as well. Saved by faith, judged by works, which is a fairly typical New Testament tension. So, I mean, there's several parts of the Gospel of John which I just have, etched into my mind, and and something happens and I always think about them. Or if someone asks me to, I can do a devotional or a sermon on one particular text. These are the sort of things I would normally go to. I mean, if you were asked to speak on one text or one passage from John's Gospel, whether it's for a class or a sermon, do you have a favorite one in mind?
Well, I do love the high priestly prayer of Jesus, John 17. And actually, once upon a time, I considered doing my dissertation on John 17 because I've been fascinated by that passage. I actually applied to study with Richard Bauckham for my PhD, and I was going to do John 17, but he had just retired. Or he was going to have one more year and then retire. So it didn't work out, but that's always been on my heart. And for some of the reasons that you mentioned, John is one of the most intimate and relationship-oriented gospels, both because of the love language, but also just the images of intimacy. And this comes into play in 17, but earlier than that, you have the image in chapter 1 of laying at the chest, right? The Son laying at the chest of the Father. And then you have that same image later on of the beloved disciple laying at the chest of Jesus. That gives that sense of closeness, intimacy. We see that in that farewell discourse, but we also see it in chapter 17 with the focus on oneness and knowing one another. And when it says that they may know you, the one true God, and Jesus Christ whom you've sent, and then I'm in you and you in me, and we are in them, and so forth. I think nowadays with church, when people get frustrated with the scandals and the business mindset of the church, I think John can give us a really good reset on that with the notions of table fellowship, intimacy, close relationships, authenticity, vulnerability. John actually gives us so much of that. He teaches us so much about the church without using the term, which has always been a question, why don't they use the term? But I think he wants to orient it around personal relationships, which comes out pretty clearly in this gospel.
Yeah, excellent. In terms of literature, what's the best thing you've ever read about the Gospel of John? I mean, do you have a favorite commentary or a favorite article or anything like that, Nijay?
Yeah, a few things come to mind. One of them is, I'd probably say commentaries. I want to say Keter, but it's just so encyclopedic. I tend to just poke in when I have to. I'd say that the commentary I'd enjoy sitting down and reading is Andrew Lincoln's Black's New Testament commentary, which is really good. Lincoln, cut his teeth on Ephesians and Colossians, but really distinguished himself as a Johannine scholar by his commentary. He also read a really nice monograph, if you might remember, called Truth on Trial, the lawsuit motif in the fourth gospel, which that's what I thought of when you're talking about all the trial scenes in John. Lately, my favorite thing that I've read on the Gospel of John is the work that Harold Attridge has been doing on genre bending. So he did a major JBL article, but then he's also done some recent work on this. And what I like about that is Attridge argues that John knows about the historicizing work of the synoptics, and he wants to add to that something that's going to get the reader into more of a direct encounter with Jesus. And so he kind of ratchets up the drama, the conflict, So he just kind of increases all these things to bring the reader to kind of these shock moments. And it's really good essay that he's written on that, a couple of places, and I found that really interesting. What about you? Are there certain things that really stand out to you?
Well, I work in the hallowed halls of Leon Morris,
Well,
Australia's greatest biblical scholar. So I cannot help but mention great Leon Morris, his John commentary, series of studies he did as well. Other things I found helpful. Anything by M.M. Thompson is pretty good. Her little book on God
yep.
and the Gospel of John, and several other things she's written. I do like my CKs, which is not just Craig Keener. I think I find Craig Keener. It's not as big as his Acts commentary, which is
No.
like massive. So it's a little bit more readable. Well, not say readable, but it's a little bit less intense.
Unreadable.
Well, his John commentary is a little bit less intense, but still very informed. The other CK I like is Charles Barrett.
Yeah.
CK Barrett. I think even though his stuff came out, like second edition was 1978, I still find it incredibly insightful and sober. People think, oh, well, this is Gnosticism or something, and he often say, oh, it's nothing to do with it. Typical sort of English dismissal. So I find him very useful. I don't mind. I still like D.A. Carson's commentary. I find that very good. And I find that's also a very good one for preachers, because Carson is thinking of John in light of biblical theology and in light of preaching as well. So yeah, those are some of my sort of go-to resources. Although another one thing I did read in seminary was a little book. It's probably not that well known, by an Australian scholar called John Pryor, called Jesus is the Christ, where he argues that John's gospel is written partly, at least, to evangelize diaspora Jews. And I thought that was fairly persuasive. And I mean, in the few times where I've written on John, I found myself thinking back to that time I read John Pryor's work and thinking, I actually think that works a bit. He's trying to show that Jesus is the Messiah and fulfills, many of the things that Hellenistic Judaism values, whether that's God's word or wisdom, truth, testimony to God. So that's some of the things that I've read over the years that have stayed with me. When I assign this when I teach a course on it, I usually just tell people to go find, here's about a half a dozen commentaries, go read one. But probably the book I tend to assign as a textbook is Craig Kester's, which is another CK.
Another
CK.
Another Craig.
Craig Keener, Craig Kester, Charles. No, it's not CK. It's Charles Barrett. Well, I'm thinking it's Charles Kingsley Barrett.
Charles Kingsley. It's a CK of a kind.
It's a CK of a kind. CK is the middle name.
Yeah.
So
Kester's really good. Are you talking about symbolism? His symbolism book?
Oh no, he's got a textbook called The Word of Life.
Oh, that one, the little one. Yeah.
Yeah.
That one's an excellent one.
So that's the one I tend to assign to students. I think he gives a good summary of the major themes, and I love all of Craig Kester's stuff. His stuff on Hebrews and Revelation, I think, is brilliant.
Right.
Part of me wishes he'd do. I don't know if he's going to do a replacement volume for the Raymond Brown and the Anchor Bible series, but that would be a terrific read. Although it's hard to replace Brown. It's
right. You don't replace Brown.
It's a bit of a classic. It's probably one of the better volumes of the Anchor series. So that's some of my favorite stuff from the Gospel of John.
Is there a method? I know that there's so many tools you can use to study the Gospels. There's narrative stuff, there's rhetorical stuff, there's historical, critical, and all kinds of stuff. Are there methods for the Gospels that you gravitate towards? What's that this is all the rage, so I'm curious what your approach is.
Yeah, I mean, on the historical side, I like the historical questions like who was John, and how does John's gospel end? Is chapter 21 an epilogue that was added? Because I think there is a little bit of a complexity with the ending of John's gospel, and a guy called Armin Baum, very good German scholar, he wrote a really good essay about the ending of John's gospel. And I think that was edited in a book called Early Christian History, edited with Jason Master. That's probably one of the best things that helps me both understand, and I was persuaded by his thesis about the ending of John's Gospel. So I find there's some good historical riddles going on. But when I get to John, I don't want to do all that historical critical stuff. I mean, I just feel like, that's kind of dull. I mean, if you're doing that, it's boring. I mean, there's a place for it, but that's something you read on the side. So I prefer something more of the narrative, looking at the tensions, definitely the irony. Getting the Alanis Morissette on isn't ironic, particularly when Caiaphas says how one man must die for the nation. That's true, but not for the reasons that he thinks it is. So, I mean, there's all sorts of stuff like that, getting into the nature of faith, some of the more challenging words, and simply teasing out the story, enjoying the story, and trying to savor in the spiritual landscape and the theological depth. That's what I think that the Gospel of John is for. That's how I think it should be read.
Yeah, I like every Christmas, my family watches the Harry Potter movies. And so we've seen them a lot, and we know all the stories, we know the events. So we always try to find something new when we watch it, like something we didn't catch before, some foreshadowing, some connection. And I encourage that with the Gospels. We're so familiar as Christians with the stories and, how they're going to unfold. And I remember I don't know if you remember Stephen Barton, he was my doctoral supervisor. But Stephen, I remember sitting on one of his undergraduate courses, and he said to the students, read the Bible in such a way that it will surprise you. And I love that as a posture for reading the Gospels. Read them in such a way that they're going to surprise you. How can something surprise you that you've already read? But there's certain mentalities that we're in where we're kind of just enjoying the details, where we're enjoying the little things, and we're appreciating things like foreshadowing and flashbacks and narrative asides. And we're kind of appreciating the artistic quality that goes into the storytelling, and that enhances the reading. And I think that there's a lot to enjoy in the Gospel of John.
Do you ever watch the Gospel of John movie?
There's so many. I don't know which one, because there's a bunch.
I think there's only one. I mean, there's lots of Jesus movies, but they made the Gospel of John a movie using the Good News Bible. It's got the actor from Lost playing Jesus.
Yes, I have seen that one.
So what I tend to do when we teach, we because it's on YouTube, we go into YouTube, we watch the scene or the passage we're going to exegete in the sort of dramatic, and then we kind of direct. So our Bible reading, if you like, is usually just a scene from the Gospel of John movie. And then we sort of delve into it. And it's good because you get to interpret both the text, but then you can also interpret a little bit. Like, did you notice how, that person was, the woman at the well was portrayed in the movie, despite the fact she had a really weird American accent. But if you can get beyond that, it's not too bad. So yeah, okay, that's good. That's good.
Yeah.
Well, Nijay, final thoughts on the Gospel of John.
I think that my final thought would be about Christology, because I'm interested in your take on this. So the way I explain this to my students, and I just completely made this up, so you can tell me if I'm completely off, but in terms of Christology, you talked about divine Christology for sure, but then a very human Christology, and has that square with the synoptics. You have a Jesus who says, I'm thirsty, and you have a Jesus who's tired. So what I like to, so I like to say to my students, imagine I'm doing this on my screen here. Imagine, the real, the Jesus of history says a lot of things along a kind of algorithm. And so he's saying things that are kind of like, why do you call me good? No one is good but God. But then he says these things like, I and the Father are one, and like this. And what John does, if the synoptics narrate the whole algorithm, what John does is says, what if we just look at the peaks? And we just talk about, and then we just create a story around those. And I don't know, I'm just curious, because I wonder if he's like, what if we just create a picture just around those highs and lows? That would give you a very interesting Jesus, maybe even the Jesus of John. I don't know if what your thoughts on that.
Well, I think that's probably a good way of thinking about it, because on the one hand, the Gospel of John Jesus, Johannine Jesus, is very human. There's no doubt he's not He's not a docetic figure. Although, I mean, Kaiserman famously said that Jesus is just God striding along the earth, which makes a great essay topic, by the way. You know, evaluate Kaiserman's claim that Jesus is just God striding on earth. I don't think that's quite. I don't think it's quite. It's certainly not docetic or so overtly divine to mask or dismiss his divinity. But the idea that he picks the divine things to accent who Jesus is, I think is definitely true. I mean, what I found, and I've been working a bit on this recently, is that, you know, if you look at John's gospel, if you look at the way he describes him as kind of God's wisdom, you know, made flesh, if you look at these sort of, you know, these I am statements, and then you get this what we call in theology, these perichoretic statements that I am in the Father is in me. There is only one God, his only begotten Son, Jesus Christ. You know, Jesus exercises the judgment of God. He does the salvation of God. People should honor the Son as they honor the Father. I mean, these are real incredible statements. And yet he's affirming that God is one, but he is one with God, only begotten. If you take all this together, in my mind, it clearly presses into a type of absolute divinity, not divinity as an appellation, not an honorific divinity like a deified emperor. You certainly have a very strong sense of being divine with and as God the Father being presented in the Gospel of John. And it's not because of any of those one things like pre-existence or wisdom or worship. It's the sheer overwhelming number of presentations that you get together that are presented in this unfolding narrative about the man Jesus of Nazareth that becomes, I find, so theologically overwhelming that the conclusion, my Lord and my God, is really the only acceptable verdict you can make at the end of it. So yeah, I think I like that little algorithm thing he's picking. I think that's a good analogy. I may steal that, take it, and stick it in my pocket for later. Probably with a attribution to you at some point. So
well, it's interesting on the human side. I don't know if you've ever used this illustration, but I think it's hilarious. So, you know, you have Jesus, you know, eating with Peter at the end on the beach, right? And I like to use the illustration with my students where if you compare that to Tobit, so you have this Jewish legend of this, you know, faithful Jew, Tobit, and he sends his son on this trip, and his son is accompanied unaware by an angel, right? And throughout the whole story, he doesn't know this angel's been accompanying him. And then at the end of the story, when all the story is over, the angel kind of does the mask unveiling and says, "Ha ha, I was an angel the whole time." And it's funny, the angel in the story goes out of his way to explain, hey, you know, all those times where I was eating, I wasn't actually eating. I'm an angel. It was so funny. Tobit has to point out that for him to be an angel, he can't need food. And so when it comes to the humanist of Jesus and John, it's interesting, these moments that we kind of take for granted, I think they probably are, at least on some level, testifying to the fact that the risen Jesus is still human. He may be more than human, but he's no less than human.
Yeah, and that's probably a good point to end our discussion on, Nijay.
All right, thanks, Mike.
Well, Nijay, always a pleasure to hang out with you, man. And I'm sure our students or whoever watches this will really enjoy. We'll have to get together maybe some other time. Hope you guys aren't too deep in the COVID crisis.
We're doing all right. We actually had fires here. I don't know if you saw it on the news, but we had massive forest fires. So we couldn't go outside for like a week. So we just got out for the first time a couple days ago. So we're very happy with that.
Okay, plague and brimstone. Okay, terrific, yeah, terrific. Right. Oh man, well we're about to come into spring, so bushfire season will be arcing up. We're in deep lockdown at the moment in Melbourne, but we will survive because we have all this life to live and we have all this love to give.
That's right.
We'll survive, and God is with us too. So okay, yep. We'll end our discussion there. Hopefully for another time, Nijay.
Blessings, Mike. Bye.